Thanks for staying with us here on the summit. I would also like to thank our panelists for still being with us, Professor Gong Zhang, retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, and Joseph Rosen. Now, before we dive back into another lightning round and then open the floor to the debate, I want to move on to possibly the bigger picture here. Just before we went out to the break, we wanted to know, could Taiwan possibly be the next Ukraine? US Republicans seem to think so.
The industrial level war crimes that have been committed against the Ukrainian people, if they are forgiven in the name of peace, you will have destroyed everything we've stood for since the end of World War II. There can be no forgiving and forgetting when it comes to Putin's war crimes. There can be no backing off of helping Ukraine, because if we fail here, there goes Taiwan.
So again, I'd like to start with a 30-second lightning round. Admiral, I'd like to start with you. Is the United States testing the waters here, both literally and metaphorically? Could Taiwan be the next Ukraine?
I think what Senator Graham is getting at is the point that in order to deter someone from doing something provocative or aggressive, you have to have both the capability to do it and a credible willingness to do it. You have to be seen as credibly willing to do it. So what he says that in addition to having the right force structure to convince China not to do anything in Taiwan, China has to understand the United States is willing to back its allies and partners. And that's why staying solid on Ukraine is important to Taiwan.
Joseph Rosen?
Yeah, I completely agree. All the international efforts vis-a-vis Ukraine are designed not only to help the democracy of Ukraine and its sovereignty, but also to make a very clear signal to China not to turn Taiwan to the second Ukraine war.
Professor Gong Zhang?
Well, I think Senator Graham has a cheap shot at China. This analogy is totally inappropriate. Ukraine is a sovereign country. Taiwan is not. It's not a sovereign country. It's part of China, a sovereign part of China, recognized by the United States as a condition for establishing diplomatic relations between China and the United States. So this is an entirely internal matter. Having said that, I think Chinese government is very clear that it is still very much committed to a peaceful unification, peaceful solution for the Taiwan issue, even though it doesn't, give up the last resort of applying force, provided that Taiwan goes independent. So I think this is the Chinese government's position, and I think that analogy is totally inappropriate.
So I want to open up that even further. Professor, you've made your opinion clear there, but I'm curious to know, Joseph, should this have been a comparison in the first place? As Professor mentioned, two completely separate incidents in two very different parts of the world. Is there a comparison to be made?
Well, the comparison can be very nice academic exercise, but in reality, there's nothing to compare between Ukraine and Taiwan. To start with, China never used military means in order to achieve political goals, while Russia, all the time along history, used military power in order to achieve its political goals. Moreover, Taiwan is not part of the UN, while Ukraine is, and there are many more differences. And we also need to take into consideration the military buildup of like-minded countries, partners of the Indo-Pacific, that are also investing many efforts to prevent such a scenario in East Asia.
And Admiral, your take?
Well, first, I want to correct one thing that Joseph said. China has used military means, and you can ask the Vietnamese people about that. You can ask the Indians about it. China has, when it feels its national security interests are at risk, taken military means. So it is appropriate for the United States to feel that they may take military means in Taiwan, and to extend the discussion of the Taiwan Relations Act and how the U.S. How the United States views its relations with China. We do believe we're required to ensure that Taiwan has the weapons to defend itself against a unilateral imposition by China. and that the United States retains the right to help Taiwan in that scenario. And President Biden's made that clear on a number of occasions, but his predecessors made it clear as well. And I think it's a little disingenuous to make it sound like this is an internal matter for China and no one else is to be bothered. No one believes that. No one acts that way except China. And the United States is just doing its due diligence. So while I don't think the comparison with Ukraine is perfect, I think the credibility issue is the United States said it would do a certain level of things. We have maintained that support to pushing back on a revanchist, authoritarian, illegal invasion of Ukraine, as we would do in the very unlikely case, and I think very unlikely case, that China would do the same in Taiwan.
So then what is the long-term solution here? Neither side wants war, and yet neither side is willing to back down. Professor?
Well, I think the long-term solution should be a peaceful resolution here. I think what's preventing that from happening is the independence movement within the island, very much by the connivance and encouragement by the United States and some other countries, at least some political forces within these countries. And I think but the U.S. government should take actions to discourage the Taiwanese government from moving towards that direction. It's a very risky and very dangerous path, and it's a path to annihilation in my view. So I think peace is still hopeful, and which is premised upon that the two sides of the Taiwan Strait have some kind of a consensus that both sides belong to a concept called China, and that both sides are committed to a peaceful unification, peaceful resolution between the two sides, and I think that's the hope.
Joseph, do you tend to agree?
I agree that on the American behalf, the door is always open for a dialogue. We've seen reports on a visit of the CIA director in China, the Secretary of Defense during the Shangri-La conference in Singapore. Met briefly with his counterparts from China, so dialogue is possible, and I still believe that both parties are willing to do so. And on a very optimistic note, I would say that sometimes the motivation behind these kind of provocations are, in a way, a push from conflict towards dialogue, because as the competition intensifies and the stakes are higher, more factors in both sides prioritize dialogue than conflict.
And just in the last minute and a half that we have left here, Admiral, it's a devil's advocate question, but it has to be asked. Is the US's dealings in both the Straits of Taiwan and Hormuz in the Middle East at all connected to the upcoming 2024 elections?
So first, a couple thoughts. I do have to comment that I think the Taiwan people's move toward, concern about getting in fuller integration with China is driven as much by Hong Kong and how Hong Kong was handled by China in the last 3 years. In terms of this, I don't believe they're tied to 2024 elections. We've been doing freedom of navigation operations pretty consistently for the last 15 years across 3 administrations. One final thought I'll give you, and I agree with Professor Gong on this. We absolutely need to get communication going again. We need to have our hotline networks working. When we had the EP3 collision with the J8 in 2001, the way it was resolved and tensions brought down was through communications. That communication system is broken right now. Both sides need to work harder to make sure that we're communicating at the very senior levels of government.
It's obviously a very delicate topic, and one that continues to come up in the news cycles every time an incident like this does seem to be escalated or inflamed in such a sensitive region. We are out of time, but as we can see, not out of passion. And I do want to thank very much our panelists for being here this evening. Professor Gong Zhang, retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, and Joseph Rosen. Thank you both all very, very much for being here on Globalized Debate this evening.